In 1957, two brothers from Rotate, Minnesota, built a machine in their farm shop that would change American construction and agriculture forever. It had 3 wheels. It could spin in place inside a space barely wider than a door frame. It could lift, load, and maneuver in confinement buildings where no tractor, no loader, no piece of conventional farm equipment had ever fit. Within 20 years, that machine, refined, licensed, copied, and sold under a dozen different nameplates, would become the most widely used compact loader in American history. Contractors would run it. Landscapers would depend on it. The United States military would deploy it. By 2000, more than 500,000 units were operating on American job sites and farm lots across the country. None of them said Owatonna. A decade before the copies arrived, Owatonna Manufacturing Company of Owatonna, Minnesota, held the original design, the original patents, and the original commercial production line. They had built the machine, they had proved the market, they had sold it to American farmers who needed exactly what it could do. Then a Detroit conglomerate bought the company, and the machine, the one the Keller brothers had designed in a farm shop in southern Minnesota, went on to become an icon under every name except the one that invented it. But the real story of Owatonna Manufacturing is not the story of a patent or a licensing deal. It is the story of what happens when a regional American manufacturer builds exactly the right machine at exactly the right moment. And the forces of corporate consolidation ensure that someone else gets the credit for a generation. Every week on this channel, we tell the stories of American machinery companies that built something real and what the market or the boardroom or both did to them. Like the video, and subscribe if that history matters to you. This story begins not in a boardroom in Detroit, but on a farm in Steele County, Minnesota in 1957. Steele County, Minnesota sits in the broad, flat agricultural belt of the upper Midwest, where the soil is rich enough for corn and soybeans, but where the real economy, for most of the 20th century, ran on dairy cattle and hogs, small farms, confinement buildings, operations measured not in thousands of acres, but in hundreds of animals, tended by families who repaired their own equipment, improvised their own solutions, and expected their machinery to earn its cost in the first season. It was that world, specific, demanding, and unglamorous, that produced the machine. Cyril and Louis Keller were farmers, not engineers. They had no factory, no investor, no industrial backing. What they had was a problem. A neighbor named Eddie Vallo needed a way to clean out his turkey confinement barn, a low-ceilinged building so narrow that no conventional loader could turn around inside it. In 1957, the Keller brothers went to work on a solution in their own farm shop. The machine they built had 3 wheels, a rear-mounted engine, and a loader bucket up front. It could pivot on its own footprint. It weighed almost nothing compared to the farm loaders of the era, and it fit, with inches to spare, inside a confinement building that had defeated every piece of conventional equipment Velo had tried. The Kellers had not set out to create a new equipment category. They had set out to solve one farmer's problem in one county in Minnesota. But the machine they built in that farm shop was, in its essential architecture, the skid steer loader, the most copied compact machine in American agricultural and construction history. Word traveled the way it always traveled in the upper Midwest farm economy. Through neighbors, through co-ops, through conversations at the implement dealer and the grain elevator. By 1958, the Kellers had built a handful of units for local farmers facing the same confinement cleaning problem. By 1959, they understood that what they had was not a one-off farm tool, but a commercial product. They needed a manufacturer. Owatonna Manufacturing Company was already operating in Owatonna, Minnesota, the Steele County seat. A town of roughly 12,000 people built on the intersection of farm supply, light manufacturing, and the rail lines that connected southern Minnesota's agricultural economy to the broader Midwest market. OMC had been producing farm equipment since the late 1940s, serving the regional implement dealer network with grain augers, farm elevators, and material handlings equipment calibrated to the scale of the upper Midwest family farm. It was not a large company, it was not nationally known, but it understood its market with the precision that only comes from geographic and economic proximity to the buyer. The Kellers brought their machine to OMC. The company recognized what it was looking at. By 1958, OMC had entered into an arrangement with the Keller brothers to develop and commercially produce a refined version of the 3-wheel loader. The production machine, heavier, more capable, and built to withstand commercial use rather than farm shop improvisation, retained the essential design logic of the original: compact footprint, tight turning radius, rear engine, front loader. OMC brought it to market under their own commercial line, selling through the regional implement dealer network that already carried their auger and elevator products. The machine was not an immediate national sensation. It was a regional solution to a regional problem, and in the upper Midwest livestock economy of the late 1950s, that was enough. Dairy farmers in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa were running confinement operations in buildings designed before anyone imagined a compact loader existing. The OMC machine fit where nothing else fit. It did work that nothing else could do at any price, and the regional dealer network moved it accordingly. What OMC had built, in commercial terms, was a first-mover position in an equipment category that did not yet have a name. The skid steer loader as an American industrial category, as a line item in the W. Grainger catalog, as a product class at the National Farm Machinery Show in Louisville, as a specified piece of equipment in construction and agricultural supply chains, did not exist yet. OMC was selling the machine before the market had language for what it was. That first-mover position should have been insurmountable. In the implement business, the company that defines a category, that trains the first generation of dealers, that earns the first loyalty of the first buyers, holds an advantage that takes a decade and a superior product to displace. OMC held that advantage for less time than the history books suggest, because in Gwinner, North Dakota, a town of fewer than 1,000 people on the flat eastern edge of the state, a farm equipment manufacturer named Melro was paying close attention to what Owatonna Manufacturing had built. And Melro had something OMC did not: the engineering resources, the distribution ambition, and the willingness to refine the machine beyond its farm shop origins into something that could sell not just in Minnesota and Wisconsin, but in every state in the country. The arrangement between OMC and Melro, the precise commercial terms, the licensing structure, the point at which Melro's machine became its own product rather than a development of OMC's design, is a matter that trade records of the period document incompletely. What the record shows clearly is the outcome. Melro's machine became the Bobcat became the category, and Owatonna Manufacturing, the company that had taken the Keller Brothers farm shop prototype and turned it into the first commercial skid steer loader in American history, found itself competing in a market that a North Dakota company had learned to define better than the Minnesotans who invented it. That competition, and what it cost OMC, is where this story turns. To understand what Owatonna Manufacturing had built, and why it mattered, you have to stand inside a confinement livestock building in southern Minnesota in 1959 and understand what the American farm equipment market could not do. A conventional front-end loader of the era was a tractor attachment. It required a full-size agricultural tractor as its power source, a machine that weighed 3 tons, turned in a radius of 15 feet, and stood taller than the doorframe of most confinement buildings. You could not drive it inside. You could not turn it around if you did. The work of cleaning a confinement hog barn, moving manure, bedding, and feed waste from a low-ceilinged enclosure that measured 40 feet wide and 200 feet long, was done by hand with shovels and wheelbarrows by hired labor that was becoming harder to find and more expensive to keep every year. The post-war farm economy tightened. The OMC loader changed that equation completely. The production machine that Owatonna Manufacturing brought to market in the late 1950s weighed under 2,000 pounds in its lightest configuration, less than half the weight of the tractor that would otherwise anchor a conventional loader. Its wheelbase was narrow enough to pass through a standard confinement building doorway. Its turning radius was, for practical purposes, 0. The machine pivoted on its own center by driving its left and right drive wheels at different speeds, a mechanical arrangement that allowed it to spin in place on a surface no larger than its own footprint. The loader bucket, mounted on lift arms ahead of the operator, could fill, raise, and dump a load of manure or grain in a cycle that one operator could run continuously for an 8-hour shift without assistance. For the upper Midwest livestock farmer running a confinement operation in 1960, this was not an incremental improvement over existing equipment. It was the replacement of a 3-man hand labor operation with a single machine and a single operator. At a period list price in the range of $1,800 to $2,500, roughly $18,000 to $25,000 in today's money, The OMC loader paid for itself in a single cleaning season on a medium-sized hog operation. The implement dealer who sold it did not have to argue about the economics. The numbers were self-evident to any farmer who had spent a February morning shoveling a confinement building by hand. The regional dealer network carried the machine through Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and the Dakotas, the heart of the American confinement livestock economy. Implement dealers who already stocked OMC's grain augers and farm elevators added the loader to their floor plans with minimal friction. The machine required no special service training beyond what a competent farm equipment mechanic already knew. Parts were simple, domestically sourced, and available through the same supply channels as the rest of the OMC line. In the implement business, that kind of serviceability is not a minor convenience. It is a competitive moat. OMC's moat was real. The dealer relationships were established. The buyer loyalty in the upper Midwest, livestock counties, was genuine. The machine had no direct American competitor at its price point and capability. No German manufacturer had addressed the confinement livestock market. No Japanese equipment company had yet entered the American compact loader segment. The category belonged to Owatonna. What OMC could not control was the rate at which Melrose Manufacturing, working from the same essential design logic, refined and expanded the machine's commercial reach. Where OMC had built a regional product for a regional market, Melrose built a national distribution strategy. Where OMC sold through the existing farm implement channel, Melrose pursued construction equipment dealers, rental companies, and the emerging landscape contracting market that the post-war American suburban expansion was creating from coast to coast. The Bobcat, Melrose branded skid steer loader, introduced under that name in 1962, was not a fundamentally different machine from the OMC loader. The operating principle was identical. The mechanical architecture was recognizable to anyone who had run the OMC unit, but Melrose engineering team had made the machine heavier, more powerful, and more capable on hard surfaces and construction sites. Environments the OMC loader, optimized for confinement, building floors, and soft farm lot surfaces, was not designed to dominate. By the mid-1960s, the skid steer loader was appearing in American construction equipment rental yards, on urban demolition sites, and in the catalogs of equipment distributors who had never sold a piece of farm implement in their lives. Melrose was selling the Bobcat into every one of those channels. OMC was selling its loader to the same upper Midwest livestock farmers it had always served. The market OMC had created was growing faster than OMC was growing into it. At the National Farm Machinery Show in Louisville, the annual event where American implement manufacturers brought new equipment before the buyers and dealers who would move it through the season, OMC's loader competed as a farm product in a farm market. The Bobcat was beginning to appear in contexts that had nothing to do with farms at all. The American construction boom of the 1960s, the interstate highway program, the suburban residential development wave that was consuming farmland on the edges of every American city. These were markets that demanded exactly the kind of compact, maneuverable, load and carry capability that the skid steer loader provided. Melrose understood that. OMC, rooted in the farm implement tradition of Steele County, Minnesota, was slower to follow. That slowness was not negligence. It was the structural consequence of being a regional manufacturer, with a regional distribution network and a management culture built around the upper Midwest farm economy. OMC's strength, its deep integration into the dealer and buyer culture of southern Minnesota and the surrounding livestock belt, was also its ceiling. The company that had invented the category was being outrun in the category it invented by a competitor with a broader vision of what the machine could become. By the late 1960s, the American skid steer loader market had a hierarchy. Melrose Bobcat was at the top. OMC was a regional presence in the segment it had created. The gap between them was not closing. And in 1973, it stopped mattering, because Owatonna Manufacturing Company was sold. Before the sale, before the conglomerate, before the brand began its slow dissolution into the anonymous portfolio of a Detroit holding company, there was a period, measured in roughly a decade, when Owatonna Manufacturing Company operated at the center of something genuinely important in American agricultural life. It is worth stopping there, worth understanding what OMC was, at its peak, before accounting for what it lost. The upper Midwest farm economy of the late 1950s and 1960s was not the consolidated, industrialized agriculture that defines American food production today. It was a landscape of family operations, dairy farms running 200 head of Holstein cattle in Dodge County, Minnesota, hog confinement operations in Mower County, pushing 300 finishing animals through a single building in a single season, poultry operations in Steele County, where the labor cost of cleaning and maintaining confinement buildings was the difference between a profitable year and a break-even one. These were not large businesses by any national measure. They were the structural backbone of the regional agricultural economy, and they ran on equipment that fit their scale, their buildings, and their budgets. OMC fit that economy with a precision that no national manufacturer had achieved in the compact loader segment, because no national manufacturer had yet recognized that the compact loader segment existed. The company's grain augers and farm elevators had already established OMC's commercial presence in the implement dealer network across southern Minnesota, northern Iowa, and western Wisconsin. These were not glamorous products. An auger, a rotating helical screw mechanism that moves grain from a ground-level pile into an elevated storage bin, is not the kind of machine that appears in agricultural industry retrospectives. But in the grain handling economy of the upper Midwest, it was as essential as the combine that harvested the crop it moved. OMC's auger line was reliable, competitively priced, and supported by a dealer network that knew the company's products and trusted its parts supply. When the Keller Brothers loader design came into OMC's production line, it entered a commercial infrastructure that was already functioning. The implement dealers who sold OMC augers did not need to be educated about the company's reputation or its service support. They added the loader to the floor plan the way a hardware store adds a new tool from a supplier it already trusts. That distribution advantage, the embedded dealer relationship, was the single most important commercial asset OMC possessed in the first years of loader production. In the confinement livestock counties of the upper Midwest, the OMC loader established a presence that was, for a time, comprehensive. Steele County, Dodge County, Mower County, Freeborn County, the hog and dairy operations that defined the agricultural economy of that specific geography, ran OMC equipment because the OMC dealer was the implement dealer they already dealt with, because the OMC parts were the parts their mechanic already stocked, and because the machine did precisely what it was sold to do in the specific physical conditions, low ceilings, narrow doorways, soft lot surfaces, that defined their daily operations. The University of Minnesota Agricultural Extension Service, the network of county agents and farm advisors whose equipment recommendations carried institutional weight with the family farmers of the region, recognized the compact loader as a labor-saving technology of genuine consequence for the confinement livestock operation. Extension bulletins of the period documented the labor displacement arithmetic plainly. A confinement hog building housing 300 animals required, by hand labor, approximately 40 man-hours of cleaning per week. A single operator running a compact loader reduced that figure to under 10. The economics were not arguable. For the American hog and dairy farmer operating on the thin margins that defined post-war upper Midwest agriculture, 40 man-hours reduced to 10 was not a productivity improvement. It was the difference between a viable operation and one that could not sustain its labor costs through a full season. OMC sold into that reality directly. The company's sales literature of the period, distributed through the implement dealer network and advertised in regional farm publications, including Successful Farming and The Farmer, the Minneapolis-based agricultural magazine that reached the upper Midwest family farm audience more directly than any national publication, positioned the loader not as a technological achievement, but as a labor economics solution. The message was calibrated to the buyer. These were farmers who did not buy equipment for its engineering interest. They bought it because the numbers worked. The numbers worked, the dealers sold the machine, and for a period that extended through the early 1960s, OMC occupied a position of genuine regional dominance in the compact loader segment it had created. The company's peak employment at the Owatonna plant, industry records of the period suggest several hundred workers, with estimates ranging from 300 to 500 at the height of production, was not large by the standards of the American manufacturing industry. But in a town of 12,000 people in Steele County, Minnesota, it was consequential. OMC was not a factory that Owatonna noticed. It was a factory that Owatonna depended on. The payroll moved through the local economy in the way that a mid-sized regional manufacturer's payroll always moves, through the hardware store, the grocery, the implement dealer's own parts counter, the savings accounts of the machinists and assemblers and welders who came in every morning and built the machines that went out every afternoon on flatbed trucks heading for the farm, implement dealers of the upper Midwest. That is what OMC was at its peak. Not a national brand, not an industrial legend, but a functioning, embedded, genuinely essential piece of the regional agricultural economy, a company that had identified a real problem, built a real solution, and delivered it through a real distribution network to the buyers who needed it most. It was enough to build a company on. It was not enough to defend one. The machine that OMC had commercialized was, by the mid-1960s, demonstrating a capability that its inventors had not anticipated, and its original market had not demanded. The skid steer loader was leaving the farm. On the edges of every American city, suburban residential development was consuming agricultural land at a rate that the post-war housing boom made inevitable. Subdivisions required site preparation, grading, trenching, foundation excavation, debris removal, in spaces that were too confined for full-size construction equipment and too demanding for hand labor. The compact loader fit those spaces the way it had fit the confinement barn. It went where nothing else went, moved what nothing else could move, and put one operator in the seat where a contractor had previously scheduled a three-man crew. The American construction industry discovered the skid steer loader, not through farm implement dealers, but through equipment rental yards, the emerging commercial infrastructure of post-war American contracting, where a small builder or landscaping crew could rent a machine by the day rather than carry the capital cost of ownership. Rental yards in Minneapolis, in Chicago, in Detroit, in the suburban corridors of New Jersey and California, began stocking compact loaders in the early 1960s. The machine that had been designed for a turkey barn in Minnesota was now moving concrete block onto residential construction sites from coast to coast. Melrose Bobcat was in those rental yards. OMC's loader, for the most part, was not. This was the strategic divergence that defined the competitive gap between the two companies through the 1960s. OMC's commercial infrastructure, its dealer network, its sales force, its trade show presence, its advertising spend, was calibrated to the farm implement market. That market was real, and OMC served it well. But the farm implement market was also finite, geographically concentrated, and tied to the economic cycles of the upper Midwest agricultural economy. A drought year in southern Minnesota was a slow year for OMC's loader sales. A collapse in hog prices was a quarter where the Steele County implement dealer did not place a new equipment order. The construction and rental market that Melrose was penetrating had different cycles, different buyers, and different scale. A construction equipment rental company in suburban Chicago was not affected by Minnesota hog prices. A landscaping contractor in New Jersey did not care whether the Steele County corn harvest had come in under expectations. The construction market insulated Melrose from the agricultural downturns that periodically compressed OMC's commercial opportunity. By the late 1960s, the American skid steer loader market had expanded well beyond the confinement livestock application that had created it. Industry estimates of the period, reported in trade publications including Implement and Tractor, the equipment industry's primary commercial journal, which tracked new product categories and market share trends across the American implement and construction equipment segments, suggested that the compact loader was establishing itself as a distinct equipment category with annual American sales measured in the thousands of units and growing at a rate that no single manufacturer had yet fully captured. The category that OMC had created was becoming one of the fastest growing segments in American equipment manufacturing. OMC held a fraction of it. The stakes of that competitive position were not abstract. Consider what the American skid steer loader market became in the decade that followed OMC's 1973 acquisition, a category that by 1980 represented tens of thousands of units annually in American sales alone, that by 1990 had expanded into construction, landscaping, agriculture, municipal maintenance, and military logistics applications, and that by 2000 had produced an installed American fleet estimated at more than 500,000 machines. The royalty streams, the parts revenues, the dealer network economics, and the brand equity attached to the dominant position in that category were worth, by any reasonable commercial calculation, hundreds of millions of dollars. The Keller brothers had designed the machine that created that category in a farm shop in Steele County, Minnesota, in 1957. Owatonna Manufacturing had commercialized it, and the financial returns of the category, the full arc of what the skid steer loader became in American commercial life, accrued almost entirely to Melro, to Clark Equipment Company, which acquired Melro in 1969, and ultimately to Ingersoll Rand, which acquired the Bobcat line in 1995 and sold it to Doosan of South Korea in 2007. That is the stake sentence for Owatonna Manufacturing Company. The company that invented the category did not survive long enough to profit from what the category became. The machine outlasted the manufacturer by half a century. The nameplate on the surviving machines said Bobcat. The engineering logic inside them said Keller. At its commercial peak in the late 1960s, OMC was producing equipment that reached farmers in Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, the Dakotas, and the adjacent agricultural states of the upper Midwest. The Owatonna plant employed several hundred workers in a production system that combined fabricated steel components, purchased hydraulic and drivetrain assemblies, and final assembly operations calibrated to the company's regional production volumes. The plant was not a mass production facility by national standards. It was a mid-century American regional manufacturer operating at a scale appropriate to its market, efficient within its geography, competitive within its category, and entirely unprepared for what corporate consolidation would do to it in 1973. The decade between OMC's commercial launch of the loader and its acquisition by Allied Products Corporation was the company's entire run at relevance. 10 years, one machine, one market, one window. The window closed in Detroit. The turning point arrived not as a crisis, but as a transaction. In 1973, Owatonna Manufacturing Company was acquired by Allied Products Corporation, a Detroit-based industrial conglomerate whose portfolio spanned agricultural equipment, construction machinery, and industrial components across multiple American manufacturing sectors. Allied Products was not a farm equipment company. It was not a precision manufacturing company. It was a holding company, operating in the conglomerate model that defined American industrial finance through the late 1960s and 1970s. Acquire regional manufacturers with established market positions, rationalize their operations under centralized financial management, extract the cash flows that their embedded dealer networks and product reputations generated, and redeploy that capital across the portfolio. The acquisition price for OMC has not been definitively established in the public record. What the record shows is the outcome. Allied Products brought Owatonna Manufacturing into a corporate structure that included, among other holdings, the New Idea Farm equipment line, the Coldwater, Ohio implement manufacturer, whose manure spreaders, forage harvesters, and corn pickers had served the Eastern Corn Belt farm economy for nearly a century. New Idea was itself a company with a distinguished American manufacturing history and its own set of competitive pressures. Under Allied Products, both companies competed for capital allocation, management attention, and strategic priority within a conglomerate that measured its holdings by their contribution to consolidated financial performance rather than by their position in any specific American equipment market. For Owatonna Manufacturing, the consequences of that corporate context were structural and immediate. The product development investment that a first-mover company requires to stay ahead of its imitators, the engineering resources, the prototype testing, the dealer network expansion, the trade show presence that signals to buyers and competitors alike that the originator is still driving the category, did not arrive from Detroit. Allied Products managed OMC as a cash-generating regional manufacturer, not as a technology leader in a growing equipment category. The loader line continued. The auger and farm elevator products continued, but the aggressive product development that Melro was pursuing, heavier lift capacities, more powerful engines, attachments that expanded the Bobcat's application range from farm lots to construction sites to urban utility work, was not matched by Owatonna. The gap that had been opening through the 1960s became, under Allied Products ownership, a gap that OMC had no organizational mechanism to close. Force 4, corporate consolidation, was not the only pressure bearing on Owatonna Manufacturing through the 1970s. The American farm economy itself was entering a period of structural transformation that would, within a decade, reshape the buyer base that had sustained OMC's regional market position since the late 1950s. The Upper Midwest livestock operation, the 200-head dairy farm, the 300-head hog confinement, the family poultry operation in Steele County, was consolidating. Federal agricultural policy through the 1970s, shaped by USDA Secretary Earl Butz's directive to American farmers to plant fence row to fence row and produce at maximum scale, accelerated the consolidation of American agricultural production into larger and fewer operations. The small and mid-sized confinement livestock operations that had been OMC's core buyer base were either expanding into operations large enough to justify full-size equipment or contracting out of livestock production entirely as commodity price cycles made small-scale hog and dairy farming economically untenable. The farm credit crisis that arrived in the early 1980s completed what the consolidation trend had begun. Between 1980 and 1986, American farm debt, inflated by the land price bubble of the 1970s and punctured by falling commodity prices, rising interest rates, and the 1980 Soviet grain embargo, produced the most severe agricultural financial crisis since the Great Depression. Farmers across the Upper Midwest lost operations that had been in their families for 3 generations. The implement dealer network that served them contracted with equal severity. Dealers who had carried OMC equipment through the 1960s and 1970s closed their doors, merged with regional chains, or dropped product lines that could not move inventory in a market where their customers had stopped buying. Force 5, the farm implement dealer network collapse, was not a gradual erosion for Owatonna manufacturing. It was the simultaneous contraction of the distribution infrastructure and the buyer base that the company's entire commercial model depended on. The dealers who had sold OMC loaders to Minnesota livestock farmers in 1965 were, by 1983, either out of business or consolidating their floor plans around the brands with the deepest national support, the strongest parts availability, and the most recognizable names in the compact loader segment. Bobcat was that name, OMC was not. The specific moment at which Allied Products made the decision to rebrand OMC's loader line under the Mustang name, consolidating the company's compact loader products under a distinct brand identity separate from the Owatonna manufacturing corporate name, represented the final erasure of the original commercial identity. Trade records of the period suggest this transition occurred through the late 1970s and early 1980s, as Allied Products rationalized its equipment portfolio and sought to differentiate its compact loader products from the Owatonna manufacturing corporate identity that had become, in national market terms, a regional footnote rather than a category-defining brand. The Mustang loader, Allied Products' rebranded compact loader line, competed in the American skid steer market through the 1980s as a secondary brand in a category dominated by Bobcat. It was not without merit. The machines were functional. The dealer network, diminished but surviving, moved units into the farm and light construction markets. But the brand carried none of the category definition authority that Bobcat's 2 decades of national distribution had built into the American equipment buyer's understanding of what a skid steer loader was and who made the best one. By the mid-1980s, the American compact loader market had a clear hierarchy. Bobcat, owned by Clark Equipment, distributed nationally through construction and farm equipment channels, supported by a parts and service infrastructure that reached every state, held the dominant position. Case, John Deere, and New Holland had entered the segment with their own skid steer loader lines, leveraging their existing dealer networks and brand equity to take share from the secondary competitors. Mustang, carrying the ghost of Owatonna Manufacturing's original market position, competed at the margin. The Owatonna plant continued to operate through the 1970s and into the 1980s under Allied Products ownership, but the investment profile of the facility reflected its status within the conglomerate's portfolio. Capital expenditure at the Owatonna plant was not directed toward the product development and manufacturing modernization that would have been required to compete with Bobcat's engineering advances. It was directed toward maintaining production at a cost structure that Allied Products financial management found acceptable. The machinists and assemblers who had built OMC equipment in Steele County, Minnesota through the 1960s and into the 1970s were working by the early 1980s in a facility that the conglomerate that owned it regarded as a legacy asset rather than a strategic investment. The difference between those two designations is the difference between a factory with a future and one that is being managed toward an exit. The exit came. Allied Products divested the Owatonna manufacturing operations as the agricultural equipment market contracted through the mid-1980s. The Mustang Loader brand passed through subsequent ownership changes that took it further from its Minnesota origins with each transaction. The Owatonna plant, the factory in Steele County where the Keller Brothers farm shop prototype had been turned into a commercial product that defined an American equipment category, ceased to function as a going manufacturing concern. The last loader left the Owatonna plant. The dealers filed no more orders. The machinists dispersed to other manufacturers, to retirement, to trades that still had work in a regional economy, adjusting to the loss of a mid-sized employer. The Mustang name survived, detached from Minnesota, detached from the Keller Brothers, detached from the implement dealer culture of the upper Midwest that had given it commercial life. The Owatonna name did not. The Mustang Loader brand did not die with Allied Products' divestiture of the Owatonna manufacturing operations. It survived, attenuated, repositioned, and carrying increasingly little of the original Minnesota identity, through a succession of ownership changes that took it into the 21st century under the management of Mustang Manufacturing Company, and later through the ownership of Yanmar of Japan, which acquired the Mustang Compact Equipment line in 2012. The machines bearing the Mustang name that operate on American job sites today are manufactured in facilities that have no connection to Steele County, Minnesota. The engineering lineage that connects them to the Keller Brothers' 1957 farm shop prototype is real but attenuated. The design logic of the skid steer loader is now so thoroughly standardized across the global compact equipment industry that tracing any single machine's ancestry to Owatonna is an exercise in industrial archaeology rather than commercial reality. The Owatonna Manufacturing Company name itself does not appear on any machine operating in the American market today. It appears in the collections of the Steele County Historical Society in Owatonna, Minnesota, which preserves the documentary record of the company's role in the regional agricultural economy. It appears in the Agricultural History Archives of the University of Minnesota Extension Service. It appears in the recollections of the farmers and implement dealers and factory workers of southern Minnesota who were present for the decade when OMC was the company that had built something no one else had thought to build. It appears, most consequentially, in the engineering record of every skid steer loader that has ever operated on American soil. The American secondary market for surviving OMC-era equipment is thinned by the standards of the vintage machinery collector community, not because the machines were poorly built, but because the production volumes were regional, and the commercial lifespan of individual units in the hard-use confinement, livestock, and construction environments was measured in years rather than decades. Surviving examples of OMC's original loader line appear occasionally in Midwestern farm estate auctions. The Steele County, Dodge County, and Mower County farm dispersal sales, where 3 generations of equipment accumulation meets the reality of a family operation that has no 4th generation to inherit it. At those auctions, an OMC loader in working condition commands prices that reflect functional utility rather than collector premium, a few $1,000s. Sold to a buyer who needs a compact loader and recognizes that the machine, maintained by the family that ran it since new, still does the work it was built to do. The Bobcat, by contrast, has achieved something that no piece of American farm equipment achieves without a half-century of continuous market dominance. It has become a generic term. In American construction and agricultural vernacular, a skid steer loader of any brand is, to most buyers and operators, simply a Bobcat, the same linguistic absorption that turned Kleenex into the word for facial tissue and Xerox into the word for photocopying. Bobcat achieved that status not because it invented the machine, but because it dominated the category long enough and completely enough that the brand became the object. The company that invented the object is remembered, if it is remembered at all, as a footnote to the Bobcat story. The American Precision Museum in Windsor, Vermont, the institution that preserves the documentary and artifact record of American precision manufacturing, does not hold OMC material in its primary collection. The Smithsonian National Museum of American History, which maintains agricultural and industrial machinery, collections of considerable depth, holds the broader story of American compact equipment development. The specific Owatonna manufacturing chapter of that story exists most completely in regional Minnesota archives rather than national institutional collections, a geographic distribution of the historical record that mirrors, with painful accuracy, the geographic limitation of OMC's commercial ambition. The factory site in Owatonna, Minnesota, the Steele County plant where the Keller brothers' prototype was turned into a production machine, where several hundred workers built the equipment that served the upper Midwest livestock economy through its most prosperous post-war decade, has passed through uses that reflect the standard American fate of the vacated regional manufacturing facility. The building did not become a landmark. It did not become a museum. It became, in the way of most such buildings in most such American cities, a real estate problem to be solved by whoever held title when the manufacturing stopped. Owatonna itself, the city of roughly 25,000 people that Steele County seat has grown into, has diversified its economic base in the decades since OMC ceased to define a significant portion of its manufacturing employment. Federated Insurance, which has maintained its headquarters in Owatonna since 1904, is the city's most prominent employer. The agricultural economy that surrounded and sustained OMC's original commercial context still operates in Steele County, though at a scale and in a form, consolidated, industrialized, GPS-guided, that the Keller brothers would not have recognized from their 1957 farm shop. Here is the surprise that the Owatonna manufacturing story carries into the present. The machine the Keller brothers built in 1957, the machine that OMC commercialized and Melrose refined, and Clark Equipment nationalized, and Ingersoll Rand industrialized, and Doosan globalized. That machine is, today, the single most commonly rented piece of construction equipment in the United States. The American Rental Association tracks equipment utilization across the national rental fleet annually. The skid steer loader, the machine whose essential design logic originated in a farm shop in Steele County, Minnesota, consistently ranks among the top 3 most rented equipment categories in the American market, generating rental revenue measured in the billions of dollars annually across the national fleet. The Keller brothers built it to clean one farmer's turkey barn. The industry it created is worth more than the entire American machine tool sector that this channel has documented disappearing, brand by brand, through the same post-war decades. None of that revenue, none of that market, none of that industrial consequence flows back to Owatonna, Minnesota. The city that gave the machine its first commercial home received, in return, a few decades of manufacturing employment, a regional implement dealer network that has itself mostly consolidated or closed, and the quiet historical distinction of being the place where something genuinely important to American industrial life was first made into a product. What the story of Owatonna manufacturing reveals about American industrial economics is not a story of failure in the conventional sense. OMC did not fail to build a good machine. It did not fail to serve its regional market. It did not fail its dealers or its buyers or its workers in the ways that mismanagement, poor engineering, or strategic blindness might have caused it to fail. What OMC failed to do, or more precisely, what its size, its geography, and ultimately its corporate ownership prevented it from doing, was to scale the category it created at the pace the category demanded. The American market does not reward invention. It rewards scale. It rewards distribution. It rewards the company that can take someone else's idea and move it faster and further than the originator had the resources to go. Melrose did not invent the skid steer loader, but Melrose understood, before Owatonna did, that the machine was not a farm product. It was an American infrastructure product, as essential to the post-war built environment as the concrete it moved and the pipe it trenched around. The company that sees what its own invention can become, before the market does, holds the category. The company that sees it second holds a regional market position until a conglomerate buys it, and a farm crisis erodes it, and a Japanese parent company eventually puts a different country's name on the machine that an American farmer designed in a Minnesota shop in 1957. Somewhere in Steele County, on a farm that has been in the same family since before Owatonna manufacturing existed, there is a compact loader in a machine shed that has not been touched in 20 years. The hydraulic lines are dry, the seat is cracked from decades of winter cold. The nameplate on the side, faded but legible to anyone who knows what they are looking at, says Owatonna. It ran a confinement hog barn for 15 years without a major repair. It moved silage. It cleared snow from a farmyard in February when nothing else would start. It did exactly what the Keller brothers designed it to do, in exactly the landscape they designed it for a farmer who bought it from an implement dealer in a county seat town that does not make that machine anymore, and never will again. See you in the next one.